In 1995, wildlife biologists in South Florida made a discovery that should have ended in celebration but instead triggered a national controversy. There were only 20 Florida panthers left alive in the wild, not 20 breeding pairs. 20 animals total, scattered across a shrinking patchwork of swamp and scrub, and every single one of them carried the same silent damage in their bodies. Kinked tails, holes in their hearts, cowlicks of fur running the wrong direction down their spines. Nearly all the males were producing defective sperm. This wasn't disease, it wasn't poison, it was something rarer and, in some ways, more frightening. The panthers were quite literally running out of new genes. The Florida panther, Puma concolor cori, once ranged across the entire southeastern United States, from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic, from the Gulf Coast up through the Carolinas. Early settlers considered it vermin. Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Florida, nearly every southern state paid a bounty on panther scalps well into the 20th century. By the 1950s, the species had been shot, trapped, and poisoned out of existence everywhere except the very bottom tip of Florida, where dense cypress swamp made hunting difficult enough that a handful survived. When the Endangered Species Act passed in 1973, the Florida panther was one of the first animals placed on the list. But protection on paper didn't undo what decades of isolation had already done to the population's DNA. Here's the problem with a species reduced to a few dozen individuals confined to one small corner of one state. There's nowhere for new genes to come from. Every remaining panther was, to some degree, already related to every other remaining panther. Biologists call this a genetic bottleneck. And by the early 1990s, the Florida panther was living through one of the most severe bottlenecks ever documented in a wild mammal population. Geneticist Stephen O'Brien, working with the National Cancer Institute, ran blood and tissue samples from the surviving cats and found something startling. Their genetic diversity was comparable to a population of laboratory mice deliberately inbred for generations of controlled experiments. Except this wasn't a lab. This was, in theory, a wild, self-sustaining population of top predators, animals that were supposed to be roaming free across a landscape, not slowly collapsing in on themselves genetically with nowhere else to go. The physical toll was everywhere once biologists knew what to look for. Roughly 9 out of every 10 adult male panthers examined had at least one undescended testicle, a classic sign of inbreeding depression. Sperm counts and sperm quality were catastrophically low compared to healthy cougar populations out west. Kitten survival to adulthood was dismal. Many litters simply failed, or kittens died young from congenital heart defects, the same atrial septal defects you'd expect to see in a human family with generations of first-cousin marriages. The population wasn't just small. It was, quite literally, sick from the inside out, and the sickness was compounding with every new generation born into the same shrinking gene pool. By 1992, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state of Florida faced a decision that split the conservation world in two. There was really only one biological fix for a genetic bottleneck this severe: bring in new genes from outside. But outside meant something that made a lot of purists deeply uncomfortable, because Florida panthers no longer had any close wild relatives left in Florida to breed with. The nearest genetically similar population of cougars lived over 1,000 miles away in the brushlands of South Texas. Was a hybridized cat, part Texas cougar, still a Florida panther? Some biologists argued forcefully that genetic rescue would dilute a unique, geographically distinct subspecies into extinction just as surely as inbreeding would, just more slowly and with better public relations. Others argued that a genetically pure but functionally dying population wasn't worth much either. If nothing changed, the mathematical models were blunt: extinction within decades, purity and all. In 1995, after years of debate, wildlife managers made their choice. They trapped 8 female pumas from the Texas brushlands. Animals from Puma concolor stanleyana, the closest living relative to the Florida subspecies, descended from the same ancestral population before the two were separated by centuries of hunting, land clearing, and habitat fragmentation across the Gulf states. The Texas females were flown to Florida, radio-collared, and released directly into panther territory in the Big Cypress and Everglades region, with the explicit goal of letting nature do what humans couldn't do in a lab: let them breed with the remaining native males and reintroduce enough new genetic material to break the bottleneck without swamping the population's Florida-specific traits entirely. What happened next is one of the most closely tracked genetic experiments ever run on a wild carnivore population. Biologists didn't just release the Texas females and walk away. They monitored nearly every subsequent litter for years, tracking parentage through DNA testing, watching kitten survival rates, checking hearts, checking tails, checking sperm counts in the male offspring as they matured. And the numbers started moving almost immediately. Kitten survival in the hybrid offspring roughly doubled compared to litters from 2 native Florida parents. The kinked tail rate, once present in the vast majority of the population, began dropping sharply within a single generation. Undescended testicles, the telltale sign biologists had used for years to flag inbreeding depression, became far less common in males with Texas ancestry. By 2003, once the genetic rescue had clearly taken hold and researchers worried about over-diluting the native gene pool, 5 of the original Texas females, the ones still alive, were deliberately removed from the population, their job considered done. What they left behind, though, kept multiplying. From a low of roughly 20 adult cats in the mid-1990s, the population climbed steadily, past 60, past 100, and by Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission estimates in the 2010s, somewhere between 20 and 230 adult panthers living wild in South Florida, the highest number recorded since rigorous tracking began. It remains, to this day, the most frequently cited real-world success story of genetic rescue in conservation biology, taught in wildlife genetics courses precisely because the before and after data is so unusually clean. Same population, same landscape, one deliberate genetic intervention, and measurably different survival outcomes within a few short cat generations. But success brought its own uncomfortable question, one that conservation geneticists still argue about today. Every Florida panther alive right now carries some percentage of Texas cougar ancestry in its genome. For many individuals, it's a meaningful double-digit percentage. The subspecies that exists in the swamps of Big Cypress National Preserve today is not, genetically, the same animal that was there in 1950. It's healthier, it's more numerous, it's reproducing at rates that would have seemed impossible 30 years ago. But is it still, in the strict biological sense, Puma concolor cori, the Florida panther, as it was originally described and named? Or is what survived actually a new hybrid population that simply inherited the name, the range, and the endangered status of something that had already, in a genetic sense, quietly ceased to exist before the rescue ever began? There's no clean answer, and wildlife geneticists remain split on which matters more, the name and the lineage, or the animal that's actually alive and breathing in the swamp right now. Whatever you call it, the population growing back hasn't solved the panthers' problems, it's just changed what they are. More panthers now need more territory, and Florida is one of the fastest growing states in the country, with roughly 1,000 new residents moving in every single day and development creeping steadily into what used to be open ranch land and cypress strand forest between the coasts. Vehicle strikes had become, by a wide margin, the leading recorded cause of panther death. Dozens of cats killed on Florida's highways in a typical year, mostly young males pushed out of the core breeding range in the south and forced north across Interstate 75 and State Road 29, looking for territory that increasingly doesn't exist. Wildlife crossings and underpasses have been built in some of the worst corridors and have measurably reduced roadkill in those specific stretches. But they can't keep pace with how fast the surrounding land is being paved and subdivided. Male panthers need enormous home ranges, sometimes well over 100 square miles each, and South Florida is running out of contiguous space to give them. So the panther today sits in a strange, unresolved position. Genetically, it's arguably healthier than it's been in over a century. Numerically, it's more abundant than at any point since scientists started seriously counting. And yet its long-term survival now depends less on biology and more on real estate, on whether enough connected, undeveloped land still exists or can still be protected for a population that finally has the genetic capacity to grow into. Biologists solved the problem inside the panther's DNA in under a decade. The problem outside the panther, the one written in zoning maps and highway plans and subdivision permits, is still being solved, or not. One parcel of Florida land at a time. What do you think wins out first? The genetics that gave this population a second chance, or the vanishing habitat that decides whether that chance ever gets used?